Okay, so we're now recording, so going to start this webinar. So I'll just introduce myself to everyone who sees this. My name is Beth, and I run workshops and support groups at Women's Trust. Today, this webinar is going to be on understanding sexual abuse within an intimate relationship. Now, the aim of this webinar and the aim of all my work is to increase self-understanding. That can be really empowering when we understand ourselves better and we realize that our responses are normal and they're normal responses to trauma. So the aim of this webinar is to increase self-understanding of sexual abuse and trauma, and also to understand the abuse was not your fault and not your responsibility. That's really, really key. A lot of women feel very ashamed, understandably, because they've been abused. But today we're going to be thinking about how the abuse is not your fault. And we're going to think of how we can let go of shame and replace shame with self-compassion. Now, those are big aims. It's not all going to happen in 2 hours, but we can think about that. That's a starting point of this workshop. Okay, so moving on. Right. Okay, today I'd really like you to think about self-care whilst watching this webinar. If you are watching this because you have experienced sexual abuse, you may become tearful and sad or angry. This is normal. You have suffered greatly, and it is important to try and be kind to yourself whilst you're watching this, if possible. Many women who come to Women's Trust have the voice of the perpetrator in their head, putting them down and shaming them. So just while you watch this, try and think about being kind and understanding to yourself. So if you need to take a break, that's fine. You are here of your own choice. If you want to leave at any point, please do. You're in control. If you want to turn off, that's fine. If you just want to take a break and go and get some fresh air, that's absolutely fine. Or if you need to get a cup of tea, please do. Whilst I go through this webinar, I'll be reading out words, but for you, those words might trigger very painful memories. So that could be distressing for you. So please try and be very, very kind to yourself whilst watching this. It's normal to have strong reactions. You may feel very tired afterwards. And afterwards, if you're not working, if you're able to, you might want some quiet time in a safe and peaceful environment. So please think about self-care whilst watching this webinar. Okay, the contents of this webinar, just so you know what to expect, we'll be looking at some facts about sexual abuse. We're going to be looking at what is sexual abuse within domestic abuse. We're going to understand different types of sexual abuse and rape within the context of an intimate relationship. We're going to be looking at the issue of consent, and that's a big thing that comes up a lot in groups. We're going to be understanding the responses to sexual abuse whilst it is happening. And then we're going to look at some myths and facts about sexual abuse. And we're also going to look at what are the impacts of sexual abuse within an intimate relationship. And that will lead us to the subject of trauma. And then we're going to look at understanding post-traumatic stress disorder and shame. Now, this webinar is not on PTSD, but we will touch on it because it's a very real issue for many women who've experienced sexual abuse. We're going to be looking at how we can try and let go of shame and how we can think about healing. And then at the end, there'll be some signposting to organisations which can provide both legal and practical support. Okay, so just also to say that many women who come to Women's Trust have also experienced sexual abuse before the age of 18, which is a very terrible and painful thing to have gone through. In the support groups and workshops, we often talk about that and that comes up. But in this webinar, the focus will be on sexual abuse experienced as an adult. If you need support for childhood sexual abuse, these places can help. There's some websites here that you might want to look at. They have a lot of information and resources and also some services like online groups and counselling that you might be able to access. So that's just some links there if you experienced sexual abuse as a child. And if you're watching this and you did, again, please think about being kind to yourself, because it means you've really, really suffered. And childhood sexual abuse has very huge implications for people who've experienced it. So moving on, okay. Now, some of these facts you might be aware of, some you might find shocking, but I think it's really important to realize that women are not alone, and also what a huge global issue sexual violence and sexual abuse is. So every year, approximately 85,000 women are raped in England and Wales every year. Now, these statistics are always approximate because so many don't get reported. So the 85,000 is the number that we know of, but there'll be many, many that don't go reported. So it's a huge number, and that's just in England and Wales. If any of you are interested, there are the websites at the bottom here, End Violence Against Women, Violence Against Women, the World Health Organization, and a government website which publishes statistics. And if you look at those, it really is shocking how many women are affected by sexual abuse in the UK and also globally. It's a huge, huge issue. Right now, in the middle of a COVID pandemic, but I think that sexual abuse and abuse against women is an ongoing pandemic that often is invisible and not talked about enough. So 500,000 women, and again, this is an approximation, are sexually assaulted in England and Wales every year. Again, that's the numbers that we know about and the ones that are recorded, and there'll be many, many more that are not reported. So 1 in 4 women experience serious sexual violence or rape in their lives. And that's, again, that's reported. So many incidents remain unreported. As you can see in the next fact, only 15% of sexual violence incidents are reported to the police in the UK. So 85% are unreported, which is a huge, huge number. 40% of teenage girls have been pressured into sex in the UK. I put in that statistic, although this is about adult sexual abuse, just to show that this is a problem that is not going away. It really is not going away. It's a huge issue for teenage girls. In 90% of sexual assault cases, the victim knows the perpetrator. We'll be coming back to that statistic throughout this because it's so important. In schools, when you're growing up, we tend to think about stranger danger, the attacker in an alleyway, but actually the most dangerous person is the person you know, largely. So in 9 out of 10 cases, the victim knows the perpetrator, which is a huge number. And another fact is conviction rates for rape are far lower than other crimes. So approximately 5% of cases end in a conviction for the perpetrator. So of the ones that go to court, only 5% end in a conviction. If you think about all the ones that don't make it to court, it means that a tiny, tiny amount of perpetrators actually receive any punishment for their behavior. I think these facts are really shocking, and some of you may be shocked by them too. It is normal and completely understandable to feel angry when you see these facts. It's really shocking, particularly in the light of what is in the news at the moment. You know, this is a big subject for women right now, and it's normal to feel frustrated and angry. And so if you feel like that, please, again, be kind to yourself, recognize that you are not alone. And I think that that feeling of not alone, although it's awful to know it's so widespread, it's important that we don't shame the victim and we don't shame ourselves because it affects so many women. So we'll move on now to this. We're going to now be looking at understanding what is sexual abuse and sexual violence within domestic abuse. Now, a lot of you will have seen this. It's the Wheel of Power and Control. It's on a great many websites about domestic abuse and you'll probably be familiar with this from other workshops and webinars. I think the interesting thing for me about this Wheel of Power and Control, and we'll look at it in more detail, is I think it's a really useful tool for explaining psychological and coercive control. But if you look on the outside, it says physical violence and sexual violence on the outside of it. And it doesn't really go into details about different types of sexual abuse. And so today, that's what we're going to be looking at. Now, this Wheel of Power and Control is taken from a website called Coercive Control, which is in the corner there. And that's a really great resource for anyone interested in understanding more about coercive control. And it also has a lot of material about post-separation abuse as well. So we'll look at this. At the center of the Wheel of Power and Control are the words power and control, which are really important to remember because that is what the perpetrator wants over their victim. They want power and control. And how do they use that? They use intimidation. So we'll look at the part of the wheel that says using intimidation. So making her feel afraid by using looks, actions, gestures, smashing things, destroying her property, abusing pets, and displaying weapons. Then on to using emotional abuse, putting her down, making her feel bad about herself, calling her names, making her think she's crazy, playing mind games, humiliating her, making her feel guilty. And then we've got using isolation, controlling what she does, who she sees and talks to, what she reads, where she goes, limiting her outside involvement, and using jealousy to justify actions. And then we've got minimizing, denying, and blaming. So making light of the abuse and not taking the concerns about it seriously, saying the abuse didn't happen, shifting responsibility for the abusive behavior, and saying she caused it. I think someone else has just come, so I'm just going to let them in. Okay, sorry about that. Just put that away. Okay, sorry, I'll go back one page because I haven't finished that. And then we've got using children, making the woman feel guilty about the way she mothers her children, using the children to relay messages, using visitation to harass her, and threatening to take the children away. Using male privilege. Now this is when the perpetrator is a man. It's very important to say that perpetrators can be women, so this will not happen to everyone. But treating a woman like a servant, making all big decisions, acting like the master of the castle, and being the one to define men and women's roles. Then we've got using economic abuse, preventing the victim from getting or keeping a job, making her ask for money, giving her an allowance, taking her money, not letting her know or have access to the family income. And then we've got using coercion and threats, making or carrying out threats, doing something to hurt her, threatening to leave her, to commit suicide, to report her to the welfare, making her drop charges, and making her do illegal things. Now, this is the Wheel of Power and Control, but I think what's important to say about this is, oh, sorry, just go back to it, that although sexual abuse and sexual violence is on the outside, sexual abuse is also interwoven with everything here within the Wheel of Power and Control. And we'll be looking at that. Sexual abuse is often coercive. It's often subtle. For example, where it says, and using isolation, that's often used in sexual abuse. And we'll be looking a lot more at this later. Isolating a woman, using jealousy to justify actions. When a woman is isolated, it's far easier to abuse her. And you can use jealousy, sexual jealousy, to justify how you're doing it and what you're doing. I will go into this more as we carry on, but just to say that sexual abuse is interwoven with every aspect of the Wheel of Power and Control. So in this webinar, I sort of want to bring sexual abuse from the outside into it. I hope that makes sense because it's interwoven into a lot of these things and it often doesn't get talked about. I do a lot of assessments of women who come to Women's Trust, and often they will talk about all the other things, all the other elements of domestic abuse that you see here in the Wheel of Power and Control, but sexual abuse will be the last thing they talk about. That is often because of shame. which is a huge silencing factor for women. And it's also often because of self-doubt, because if you're in an intimate relationship with someone, there can be question marks about, is it sexual abuse if I've consented to sex in the past with them? Is it sexual abuse when in the past I've enjoyed sex with them? And it becomes complicated, and women often, or women might say, you know, I thought it was just normal because he's my husband, and I thought that was just a normal part of being in a marriage. So sexual abuse can get minimized, it can be denied, it can be silenced. So today we're going to be sort of bringing it out and talking about it openly. Okay, now I'm just going to look at my chat because I think there were some questions coming in. So I'm just going to look there. Oh, someone's just asking if we'll get handouts. Yes, I can send you the slides after this. Okay, so I'm just going to close the chat there and I will carry on. Has anyone got any actual questions specifically about this? No? Okay. There will be time at the end to ask more questions. Okay, so moving on. So what is sexual abuse? Sexual abuse includes rape, sexual assault, prostitution, female genital mutilation, sexual harassment, sexual bullying, and sexual abuse within partnerships. Sexual abuse is any sexual encounter without consent. This can be unwanted touching, forced sexual activity, being forced into painful and degrading sexual acts, sexual trafficking, filming, photography, which can be used to blackmail and exploit, forced participation in porn, forced sex games, forced sex when you are ill, and sadistic and violent sexual acts. Now, I know I'm reading out a list there, and it's a pretty unpleasant reading. For those of you who are watching this or listening to this now, and if you've experienced any of this, please take a moment to recognize how much you've suffered and try and think of yourself with kindness. I'm sure if you came across any other woman who'd gone through this sort of thing, you'd only feel compassion for them. So please try and have a bit of compassion for yourself. So the majority of sexual violence is perpetrated by men against women. However, it's really important to remember that sexual violence can and does occur in same-sex relationships. It can happen to anyone, regardless of gender, age, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, ability, or sexuality. It really can happen to absolutely anyone. And victims are really good at covering it up. So you can't tell from looking at someone what they've gone through, which I know you all know. And the women I work with are really, really good at covering it up. And often they don't share their experiences with anyone and they keep them secret. And when we talk about it, we realize how it can affect so many people of all backgrounds. It's also really important to say that sexual abuse can be very, very subtle. And we're going to be looking at these different forms it can take in this workshop. Subtle sexual abuse is also very, very damaging. So we'll be looking at that as well. Okay. So different types of sexual abuse in intimate relationships. So we're now going to be focusing on partner marital sexual abuse. So that be within an intimate relationship. Now the abuser may use violence to rape his or her partner, or they may use coercion and manipulation in the form of threats, such as, and that might be non-violent rape. So we might tend to think of rape as violent, and indeed it can be, but it can also be a sort of, I say the word silent, but it can be a sort of quiet, non-violent act as well. And I think that can also be confusing for women because in the media, we might grow up thinking it's always violent, and it certainly isn't. Psychological or emotional abuse may be used, leaving the victim to submit to unwanted sexual acts out of fear. We'll be looking at that later. We're going to be looking at that word submit because it's a really important one. We'll be looking at that later when we look at responses to sexual abuse. Any sexual act without mutual consent is sexual abuse, whatever form of coercion is used, whether it's financial, physical, or emotional coercion. If there is not mutual consent, it is sexual abuse. Really important to say it is not your fault. Okay, that is really, really important. I'm going to be looking more at that later. Okay, I'm just wondering if any questions have come in. Someone's come back, so I'll just let them in to the webinar. Okay. All right, no questions as yet, so I'll move on. Okay, partner and marital rape. We will now be looking at this. Again, I'm reading the words out, and I think many of you today who are listening to this will have experienced this. This is an incredibly violating, brutal, monstrous act. So please, please look after yourself while I read this out. It might bring up a physical reaction in you. You might feel shaky. You might feel sweaty. You might feel very anxious. You might get heart palpitations. So just imagine you've got someone really kind sitting next to you, looking after you right now, and please try and be kind to yourself. Okay, rape is rape regardless of the relationship between the rapist and the victim. It doesn't matter whether you've been in a relationship with that person for 1 year or 10 years, or whether there's no relationship and they're a stranger, it can still be rape. Rape is a very traumatic experience, even if it is non-violent and within a relationship. It is very traumatic, and we will be looking at trauma later, and we will be looking at why it is so traumatic within a relationship as well. So stranger rape is usually a one-off with someone you don't know. Now, the majority of rape victims, 90%, know the perpetrator. So that's the vast majority know their perpetrator. Now, in marital and partner rape, the circumstances are very different. Not only is it physically and sexually violating, it is also a huge, huge betrayal of trust. So if this is your intimate partner, the person you're married to, or your partner, or maybe the parent to your children, is the person you've known intimately, you've shared your history with them, you probably once trusted them, maybe in the past you've had consensual sex, you've made love with them, and you've really trusted this person. So when they sexually assault or abuse you or rape you, it is a huge betrayal of trust, and it's incredibly confusing. It leaves women feeling so many mixed emotions, often doubting themselves, doubting their reality. One of the biggest things I see in my work is lack of trust in humanity. We'll be looking at that later. If you can't trust your partner, if you can't trust the father of your children, if you can't trust the person who you share your life with, you share your home with, you share your bed with, then who can you trust? So trust becomes a huge, huge issue when there's sexual abuse. And if that feels familiar to you, again, please be understanding to yourself. That's a normal, completely understandable response to partner and marital and intimate relations rape. Okay. So just to repeat, that it's very, very distressing. It's very, very traumatic, as it undermines and betrays the fundamental basis of the relationship. So the victim will feel betrayed, humiliated often, and the perpetrator wants the woman to feel humiliated, or they want the victim to feel humiliated because that's part of their desire to have power and control. The victim will feel very, very confused and shamed. And shamed is a really big, big one. What happens when in sexual abuse is this is a very normal response, that the victim takes on the shame of the act. They take it on and carry the shame as if it's theirs. And what I want to say very clearly is the shame does not belong to the victim. The shame of the act belongs to the perpetrator. And it's really, really important, that distinction, because if we shame the victim, we're sort of giving the victim responsibility for what happened, when the responsibility lies purely with the abuser. So that's a really important. So in a lot of the work I'm doing at Women's Trust, we're looking at how we can release the shame and put the shame back where it belongs. Now, partner rape is usually repeated. It could be a one-off, but that's very rare. It's usually repeated. It can be frequent, it can be infrequent, but because it's usually repeated and often becomes more frequent over time, it then becomes normalized. So it might start off infrequently and then become more frequent, and then it becomes normalized for the victim. The perpetrator may deny and minimize what happens. So this is gaslighting. And this leaves the victim doubting their own reality and doubting whether it did really happen. Or are they making a fuss? If you're isolated and you've got someone sort of brainwashing you and denying your reality, it's very, very hard to hold on to your reality. So many women who come to Women's Trust don't acknowledge this as sexual abuse until they can start talking about it in a safe environment. It's often in groups when one person starts talking about it, which takes great courage. And when one person does do that, it often releases that for other women, and then they talk about it as well. So many women also blame themselves because they stayed in a relationship, and we're going to be looking at why women stay, because it's so, so important to understand that. So we'll be looking quite a lot at trauma bonding in this webinar. Just to say that sexual abuse is never, ever the fault of the victim. I 100% believe that. And I hope that if you're watching this, you can believe it, or even just start believing that too. It is not your fault. It is the responsibility of the perpetrator. Sexual abuse is another way, it's another tool that the perpetrator uses to get power and control over their victim and to humiliate them. Now, I know this probably has been distressing for some of you, so I really hope you're okay. It looks like I've got a question, so I'm just going to look at that and see if anyone's asked anything. Why is there shame in the victim? That's a good question. I'm going to be looking at shame a bit more in this webinar. It's hard to sort of articulate it really well, and that's a really good question. I think what it is almost to me like an energy transference, and this is just my take on it. But perpetrators project; they project their pain and their issues onto the victim, and a similar sort of energy transference often happens within abuse, that they walk away from it absolutely feeling fine or appearing fine, and then the person who has gone through it, the victim, takes on the horror of that act and feels it, and because they've been violated and intruded upon, it's sort of almost the horror of that act becomes internalized, and they feel it is their fault in some way, and they take on the shame, and that's a really normal response. I think also with sexual abuse, because we're talking about abuse within a partnership, the context of it also makes it more shaming, because women often say things like, well, I chose to stay, or I have had sex with him in the past, or, last week I wanted to have sex with him. It becomes very, very, very confusing. And I think if it's a stranger, sometimes it can be clearer. This is sexual abuse because it's a stranger. In the context of a relationship, it can feel a bit more confusing and hard to define. But we will be talking about shame in more details later on. And yes, someone's asking if there's more information I can give on this. What I will do for the people who are watching this webinar is just to reassure you, you will get all these slides sent to you, and hopefully they will explain as we go further on a bit more about shame. And also I can always direct anyone towards any websites that might be useful as well. Okay. So going to move on now. We've probably got about 40 minutes left. So just so you're aware of time, and I hope you're doing okay. So we're going to look at non-physical sexual abuse as well as physical sexual abuse. Sexual abuse can be very subtle and non-physical, which is why it can be so hard for women to identify. Subtle sexual abuse can also be very shaming and humiliating and distressing, and it can include the following. Now, this is when we can remind ourselves of the wheel of power and control, because so much subtle non-physical sexual abuse is also part of emotional abuse, coercive control, financial abuse, and psychological abuse. So it really does fall into every aspect of the wheel of power and control. So the first thing, and I often hear about this, is excessive jealousy. This might be at the start of the relationship, where the jealousy might be interpreted as they really care, they're being protective, they don't want me to go out, they don't want me to attract other men because they're concerned about my safety. So it can start coming across to begin with like a protective mechanism, but actually it's really always about power and control. And it can grow and grow into very excessive jealousy. So I work with many women who are accused of having affairs or of looking at men in a provocative way, or trying to attract sexual attention, or dressing to sexually attract. And then we get into areas where women might be very controlled about what they wear. I've worked with many women who aren't even allowed to look at men. They have to keep their eyes down all the time, even in a restaurant. They can't look at a waiter, for example. They have to cover themselves up. They might not be allowed out in the evening. And then often they might be accused of having affairs. One thing I have seen a lot in my work is that very often when a victim is being accused of having affairs by the abuser, it's actually the abuser who is having affairs themselves. I know that's a generalization, but that's just an observation I'm making from doing this work for many years. And that's something that comes up a lot. And we'll move on now. Calling you sexually derogatory names. These names come up all the time in groups and workshops. So it might be slut, slag, tart, that sort of language, whore, or it could be the other extreme where a woman is called she's frigid, she's uptight, she's abnormal, that sort of language. So making a woman feel very ashamed about her sexuality, and also making women feel ashamed about her femininity and her womanliness. And that can really undermine a woman's confidence in herself and her femininity. So it has a huge, huge impact. These sorts of words have a huge impact on our identity as women as well. Also criticizing you sexually. It might be you're criticized for maybe your lack of experience or too much experience. You might be criticized for your sexual past or shamed for that, about how many people you've slept with or not slept with, or your past sexual encounters. Might be criticizing your technique, shaming you, ridiculing you, humiliating you in some way. And then we have withholding sex and affection. And that comes up quite a lot too. And it could be that the abuser might abuse or sexually abuse and then withhold. So when the woman feels actually that she would like to have sex or affection, that the abuser withholds that. And yeah, that's further down. I've got a line there saying controlling sexual intercourse, the sexual controller, that's sometimes called, demanding sex at impossible times or withholding sex to punish. So that withholding from sex is also a subtle form of non-physical sexual abuse. I'll go back to point 5, minimizing or denying your feelings about sex or your sexual preferences. It can, even in a healthy relationship, it can take quite a lot of sort of confidence to voice what you want sexually and talk about it openly. And if someone puts you down or minimizes you or denies that, it can be really shaming and humiliating. And again, make you feel like something is wrong with you in some way. And that's how abusers work. They put all their stuff onto the victims. The victim is always the one with the problem. Moving on, criticizing your body. This is a really something that comes up so often at Women's Trust. I work with many women who really feel a lot of shame about their bodies. It might be about their breasts. Are they too small? Are they too big? It might be about their weight. They're too skinny, or they're too curvy, or their thighs are too big, or their thighs are too skinny. And it can also be really incredibly intimate. So women being criticized about their vagina as well. That might be if women have given birth and they're told that something's wrong with their vagina, or it's too big since giving birth. It could be to women who haven't had children as well. And that comes up a lot. And again, because it's so private and it's such a private part of the body, it's something women often don't feel okay talking about. Then it takes great courage to talk about these things. And when women do talk about these issues, what comes up time and time again is they are not alone. And so many women I work with have issues around body shame. And then that can feed into issues as well about eating and food and comfort eating as well. And that can then lead into more body shame. So criticizing your body can lead to a whole load of other issues as well that are really difficult for women to manage. Moving on, not allowing women choice over birth control. That's something that comes up a lot. That can lead to unplanned pregnancies, which could then lead to unplanned babies being born. It could lead to abortions or forced abortions. Very often I work with women who've had miscarriages because of the stress of the abuse or because of physical injuries. And so not having autonomy over your body, over pregnancies, over birth control is a huge, huge issue for many women. Of course, if you're not allowed to use protective birth control, you're more likely to be exposed to sexually transmitted diseases. And that is something that comes up a lot as well. It also comes up if your partner has been unfaithful and you don't know about it. And so it can often be at the end of the relationship, a woman might find out she's been exposed to sexually transmitted diseases. And that can happen to women of all ages and all backgrounds. And that's incredibly distressing. And then the question about shame comes up as well, that we can feel really ashamed of ourselves and ashamed of our bodies. And that's incredibly sad, because what we come back to is this is not your fault. Okay, abuse chips away at you. It chips away at your confidence, at your personal power, and it chips away until you are controlled by the abuser. And we'll look later the sort of issues that will come up following sexual abuse. So we talked a bit earlier about controlling sexual intercourse, the sexual controller demanding sex at impossible times or withholding sex to punish. And then there's gaslighting after the event. I mentioned this before a bit, the minimizing or denying, but also gaslighting can also be just absolutely denying it happened. So you might say, how you're feeling about something, or even that you were raped or something very extreme, and that can be completely denied by the abuser, which then makes women feel like they're going mad and they really can doubt their own reality. I think that's the thing to say about domestic abuse. When you're in a domestic abuse relationship long term, you inhabit a sort of world that is not normal, and it's very normal to lose touch with reality in that world. Finally, financial abuse, that is on the wheel of power and control, and it can also be used to control sexual relationships. So I have worked with women where, unless they had sexual relationships or did what their partner wanted sexually, they wouldn't get money to feed their children, for example. So money can be a really controlling factor as well. Now, I've just read through that list, and it's a very distressing list, and I'm sure people listening today would have experienced, if not all, of some of these things that are on this list. So again, if you have, and it's bringing up memories for you, please try and be kind to yourself. Please recognize you've suffered and that you're a victim of sexual abuse, and it's not your fault. Okay, it is not your fault. That's a really important thing. So I hope those of you listening are doing okay. I'm going to move on. It doesn't look like any questions have come up, so I'll keep going, and hopefully more things will be explained along the way. Okay, the context of sexual abuse. Someone asked a good question earlier, why is it so shaming? And maybe this will help a little bit understand. So when the abuser is a stranger, sexual abuse is horrific and it is traumatic, absolutely horrific. But what can happen is that it can be clearer to the victim that what happened was wrong. So it doesn't take away from the trauma and the horror, but there may be more clarity about this is wrong and it's not my fault. Saying that, it's also very, very normal for any victim to take on the shame and guilt about the attack, even though it is never, ever her fault. Okay, so just be really, really clear about that. But we're discussing the sexual abuse within a domestic abuse relationship, which can complicate things a bit. When the abuser is someone we're in an intimate relationship with, a partner, family member, or friend, it becomes incredibly confusing and distressing. And this is because it's someone we previously trusted. And because of that, it's normal to feel a lot of self-doubt about it. You know, we can't quite comprehend that someone we loved and trusted would behave like this. And so we try and explain their behavior or justify it or try and find a reason for it. And I work with many, many women who are really empathic, and they will try and understand why their partner is behaving like that. And they might say, oh, he was just really stressed. He was having a really bad time at work, or he's really worried about money, or he had a really bad childhood, or he was abused as a child and he doesn't really know what he's doing, or he was drinking, he didn't know what he was doing. And that's a very normal thing for us to do, to try and make excuses or try and make sense of their behavior. But when that happens, we can then sort of shift the responsibility on ourselves and think, well, maybe if I behaved in a different way, he wouldn't have done that. And that's when it becomes sort of dangerous, I think, where we start blaming and shaming ourselves and doubting ourselves. So if it is a partner who we have had consensual sex with in the past, it can feel very confusing to work out our rights within the relationship. If we've wanted sex with someone in the past or have agreed to certain sexual acts, then do we have a right to say no now? And we'll be looking at consent later. Absolutely. You always have the right to say no, or if you can't say no, to express that you don't want to. We're going to be looking at consent because it's complicated in some ways, but we will look at that later. I'm not going to say too much about this because this is a big subject. There can also be a cultural or religious pressure to please our partner. This can be cultural, it can be social, it could be religious. This is a huge, huge subject, and you all know as you watch this, the sort of culture, the sort of how you were raised, what you feel you have to do to please your partner. And that can really vary across cultures. It can, I mean, for example, and that isn't always to do with religion or culture, it could be to do with social pressure. Quite a lot of young women who come to Women's Trust talk about sexually violent porn that their partners watch and how that's become normalized and how there can be a pressure to act out things that are in porn. And if they don't do that, then they're seen as something's wrong with them or they're uptight. So there can be pressure can come from many, many different places. But there can be also religious or cultural belief that it is a woman's duty to please her husband sexually, and that you are failing in your duty as a wife if you say no to sex. And that can also be really hard for some women as well. We will be looking at consent later. I think a question's come in, so I'm just going to see if there's a question. So someone has asked about domestic abuse can often arise or have roots in early childhood trauma. Yeah, as I said at the beginning, there's a really good question. As I said at the beginning of this workshop, of this webinar, we're focusing on abuse in adulthood. But absolutely, if you have experienced trauma as a child or sexual abuse as a child, if it happens as an adult, the trauma can be more severe, and we will be looking at that a bit later on. So it's a good point, but today the focus is going to be on adult sexual abuse within domestic abuse relationships. So I will move on. All right. So just make sure I'm on the right page. Okay, consent. These, I think, are important things that I wanted to say about consent today. Consent is giving permission, but the really important thing is it's without fear and manipulation and coercion. I'll explain a bit more. To give consent, you need to have the capacity to do so. And this is where it can get confusing, because many women who I work with understandably will say things like, I didn't say no. I hear that quite a lot. I didn't say no, and therefore it's my fault. And I want to say, no, that is not the case. In order to say no or yes, you have to have capacity. And that capacity is the belief that if you say yes or no, your response will be respected and heard and responded to. And that is what is missing in domestic abuse relationships. The victim is scared. And when you are scared, you do not have capacity. Okay, you do not have the personal power to express a yes or a no. You are scared. Okay, so when you are scared, issues around consent become different, because when you are scared, you should not, no one should be asking you to do anything when you're scared, because you do not have the capacity to say yes or no. So just repeat this. So consent is giving permission without fear. That's the really important bit. And without manipulation and without coercion. So you will all probably have your own examples of coercive control when you were, and that can be very subtle. It can be a sort of emotional blackmail. If you loved me, you would do this. It's your duty as a wife to do this. If you don't, I will take it out on the kids. Yeah. If you don't, you'll be punished later. Now, and a lot of that communication might be non-verbal as well. The abuser doesn't always spell things out. In fact, often they don't. Very often I work with women and they say, I don't know if it was rape. I just let him do what he wanted, because if I didn't, things would be a lot worse. So if you didn't submit and give in at that moment, you'd be punished later. That might be in the form of physical attack. It might be in the form of withhold financial means for you and your family. It might be that the abuser might take out their rage on your children. So the reason that a lot of women say, I just let him do it, is actually to prevent the abuse getting worse. And in that situation, you do not have the personal power or the capacity to say yes or no. So capacity means you feel safe. And safe is the key word here. In an intimate relationship, I believe the primary thing you should feel is safe. Safe to express yourself, safe to say yes or no, in the knowledge that your response will be respected. And there's another really important word, that your response will be respected. That is not the case within a domestic abuse relationship. Your response will not be respected. You're full of fear, so you do not feel safe, and therefore you do not have the capacity or personal power to give consent. Consent also means you can change your mind and say no at any time, and that's really, really important. It might be that you're engaging in some sexual activity and then you want to stop, and that you are allowed to. Or it might be that he does something that makes you feel uneasy or uncomfortable or unsafe, and you are allowed to stop and say no at any time. And if they say, well, you've started, so therefore, you've got to let me finish, that is not true. So consent can be verbal or non-verbal. Really important to say, the absence of no does not mean yes. Okay, so just because you didn't say no, it doesn't mean that you said yes. That's really important. Also, if any of you, I'm sure, you can pick up from someone's body language if they're enjoying something, if they want to be there. We're adults, we can work it out, we can sense if someone, and so there's other ways, and abusers are not interested in reading your body language. If you're frozen, if you're crying, they will carry on. So the absence of no does not mean yes. Giving consent once does not mean you have to give consent every time. Really, really important. You may have children with this person. You may have had a lot of enjoyable sex with them in the past, and then possibly things have changed, and they're now being abusive. You do not have. You're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to say no at any point. Consent for some people might feel like a grey area, and there's actually a really good website called No Grey Area, which is saying, it's you're entitled to give consent or not give consent at any time. It is always your choice. And it's so important, if you say yes or no, you do so in the knowledge that your response will be respected. And that is what does not happen in domestic abuse relationships. So there might be some questions about that. So I've just seen a question, so I'll just see if there's something in the chat. Okay. I will, someone's asking about that website. I haven't got it on me now, but if you Google No Grey Area or No Grey Zone, it should come up, but I will send a link to people who are interested in that later. Okay, so it's 11 o'clock, so we'll move on. Right. Okay, this is also very important. We were talking earlier about shame, and why women feel ashamed, and we need to understand responses to sexual abuse to understand that. So many women feel guilt or shame because they did not say no and they did not fight back. But this is a normal response. You could not say no and you could not fight back because of the consequences and punishment you would receive. You were not safe and you did not have the capacity to give or not give consent. So in this situation, you did the only thing you could do. Your body did its best to minimize the harm and protect you from further danger. This is really important. For those of you who feel guilt or shame about this, I want you to know that you did your best. You did your best that you could have done at that time. You were terrified. And when you're terrified, you freeze. So we'll look at this later. And so you did the absolute best that you could do in that moment. Okay, so the responses to threat, and you all have heard of these, but they typically are fight. Now, some women say that I didn't fight back. Well, generally, abusers can often be a lot larger and physically stronger. So you could not fight back. You might have put yourself in more danger. You might have been killed. You might have been hurt more. If you fought back, you might well have been punished in some way. And also you froze. It's very hard to fight when you're in frozen mode. And we'll be looking more at that later. So the flight, there's the fight response, which you couldn't do, and there's the flight response. You couldn't run away. First of all, because fear freezes us, so we feel stuck, but also where would you go? If the abuse is happening in your home, in your bedroom, where are you going to go? It might be in the middle of the night. You might be naked. You're very, very vulnerable. So where are you going to run to? You might have children. What would happen to your kids if you leave the home? Many women are very, very isolated. They have no one to turn to and they have nowhere to go. And then there's also the fear that if you do run away, what will happen when you come back? You'll get punished, and that could be worse. So most typical responses are these, and you might have heard of freeze, flop, or submit. And submit is the most common. If you submit, the hope is that it will be over quicker, and it will also stop the abuser getting more angry and more violent. If you fight back, their anger, their violence could increase. So you submit. And in your moment, that is your best protection and the only thing you can do. So if you did submit, you did the best you did, and actually it might have minimized the abuse and made it stop quicker. You did the best that you could do in that moment. Many women may also disassociate in that moment. It's very normal. For example, they may feel like they are outside their body watching the sexual abuse take place. That's very normal in more violent rape, but it can happen in at many different times as well. Or you may find that your brain fixes on an object in the room and will stay with that object rather than be with your body. And that's because the horror is so awful that you fixate on something else to sort of take you away from your body and the felt sense of what's going on. Again, this is another form of protection. Your brain has shut down and it floats away, so you don't feel the horror of the experience. So that's a protective mechanism. Many women sort of almost feel let down by their body that they submitted and they didn't fight back, but your body did not let you down. It did its best to protect you. Okay, so for those of you who are watching this and who've experienced the sort of things I'm talking about, please think about how you're doing right now. You might feel a bit shaky, you might feel tearful or emotional. Please show some kindness to yourself. If you need to go and get a sweet cup of tea, a hot water bottle or something, that's absolutely fine. If you need to take a break, that's fine too. You know, we're talking about very, very severe and horrific abuse. Now, disassociation can also take place after the event, and that's very normal and very common. It's typical after the event, you will feel in shock and numb, and you may just carry on in a trance. And that's often what women do. They have just to carry on with life. They might block it out, because if you disassociate, you're not fully in your body. Another way that you protect yourself is by not remembering the horror. So your brain blocks it out to protect you from the horrific memory, but then it can leave victims very, very confused about what did actually happen. And knowing something that's awful has happened, but being really scared about remembering it as well, or remembering it fully. So it's a very, very painful, complicated place to be. It's really important to understand that you did your best to survive a terrifying and traumatic event, and there was nothing else you could have done. If any other person told you about something they'd gone through like this, I'm sure your response would be to say, you poor thing, I am so sorry that happened to you, and to be compassionate to any other woman who's been sexually abused or raped. If that has happened to you, please just try and show that same compassion to yourself. It's so important to do that. Okay, so we'll move on. There's no questions coming in, so we'll move on. Now, I think it's important when we think about sexual abuse to look at some of the myths and facts. There are some commonly held beliefs about sexual abuse that are really unhelpful, I think, and also can further shame women and further silence women. So, the myth might be sexual assault is always violent, and that survivors have physical injuries. That can happen, absolutely, and that can happen, and that's absolutely terrible. But it's also important to remember that sexual assault can often be non-violent as well. It can often be done through coercive control. A myth: if you give consent once to someone, it means you consent every time. That is not the case at all. A fact is that consent needs to happen every single time, and that you should have the capacity to safely give consent. So you need to have the capacity to give it. And if you do not have that capacity, you are being abused by someone who is controlling you. A myth: using drugs, alcohol, dressing a certain way, or certain behavior means you asked for it. Now, this belief is so wrong. Makes me angry. It shames the survivor and not the abuser. The abuser is responsible for his or her actions entirely. It does not matter what you wore, what you drank, what time of night it was, where you were. That does not matter. It is time, I think, in our society that the responsibility is put solely on the abuser and not on the victim, which is victim shaming. And it's really time we move on from that as a society. Okay, moving on, some more myths and facts. This is another myth that you might have heard, that people who report rape are lying, or maybe they're looking for attention or revenge. This is just not true. It doesn't happen. False accusations are approximately 0.5%. So over 99%, 99.5%, we know, the absolute truth. It is so negligible, that number. So it is incredibly rare for victims to lie. They just don't. The reason victims don't lie is because no one wants to go through a court case. No one wants to go to the police and talk about it unless they have to. It's not a pleasant experience. Most women want to put it behind them and want to move on with their lives. It takes great courage to report sexual abuse. It really does. So that's another myth that needs to be debunked, because it's just not true. Most women, when they report it, they're trying to get maybe some justice, or usually what they're doing is trying to stop the perpetrator from hurting another woman. So they're trying to do the right thing. And it's so important that women are supported and helped to report it in a way that is supportive for them. And sadly, I hear a lot of stories about women making reports of sexual abuse and not being treated as they should be. Another myth is sexual assault is by strangers. We know that this is not true, that in the majority of cases, the victims know their abusers. 1 in 10 women are raped within their relationship. At school, we're often taught about, that stranger danger, or the stranger in an alleyway. It's 90% of cases that the victim knows their abuser. Another myth: if you don't fight back, you want it. Not at all. We know that's not true. Most women cannot and do not fight back because of the freeze response to abuse. And also, if they fight back, it can make the abuse worse. And so they submit to minimize the abuse. And that is the most common response, and one done to protect. Okay, another myth: women will be very distressed following sexual abuse, and so they will report it immediately. Now, they might be very distressed, but usually what happens is they will go into trauma and shock. Most women also have got busy lives, and they just have to get on with their lives. They might be working, they might have to go to work to earn money, they might have kids they have to take to school. Most women will just try and cover it up and carry on as normal. And this might be because the abuse has become normalized, because it's become normalized within their relationship. It might be because they're too scared to report it, because they've been threatened that what will happen to them if they do report it. They may feel shame, and they may fear they will be blamed and not believed, especially if it's in the context of an abusive relationship. And we also know that many abusers can appear very charming and very lovely and convincing. And so many victims fear that they won't be believed. So it's very rare for someone to report it immediately. It might take several months to report it, maybe years, and it might never get reported. Another myth that's really important, because this does occasionally come up in groups, where a woman feels that because she was sexually aroused when the sexual abuse happened, that implies consent. It's really important to say that sexual arousal is a normal, automatic physical response to touch. It does not mean consent. So just because your body responded and you were aroused, it does not mean that you gave consent. Also, it is nothing to be ashamed of. I've worked with women who say, because I was aroused in some way, I feel like therefore I in some way asked for it, or I let it happen, or it was my fault, or I was giving him the wrong signals. It does not mean consent, and it is nothing to be ashamed of. So it's just really important to put that out there. Another myth is survivors can remember the details. Often if someone is very brave and they do report it to the police will ask them to go into very extreme and specific detail, and they often can't remember it. This is because of many reasons. It's because it's very common to block out the abuse. We talked earlier about disassociation and how you might be so disassociated. You might be disassociating when the abuse happened, and afterwards you might experience disassociation, which makes it really hard to clearly remember what happened. This can make it very frightening and frustrating. It can be frustrating because you might have flashbacks to certain incidents, but you might not remember the whole thing. So when you get asked specific questions, you might not be able to answer them. And also there can be the real fear of what is it that you've blocked out? What are you going to remember? And that can be really, really frightening for women too. So I hope those made sense to you. I can see a question's come in, so I'll just look at that. So I'll come to the next page in a minute. Okay. Someone has asked if you want to take a break and you don't miss anything. So that's fine with me. I will pause the recording, and if you go for a break, and then we'll start again in 5 minutes. So just look at the time now, it's 11:17. So we will start again at 11:22. I will just start at 11:22. I hope that's okay. I'm not going to be able to wait too much. I'll just see how people are feeling on the chat. Great, okay. So we'll stop now for a 5-minute break. Okay, thanks everyone. I'll see you in 5 minutes. Okay. So welcome back everyone from the break. I hope you're back, and we're going to continue. We've looked at the myths and facts, and now we're going to look at impacts of sexual abuse. Sexual violence impacts everyone in different ways. It's really important to say that there is no right or wrong way to respond or cope. The most important thing I would suggest is please don't judge yourself for your responses. That's really, really important. Everyone will respond differently, but there are some things that you may have in common here. So these are the sorts of responses that I see often. Flashbacks, very, very normal. They can be, for those of, I'm sure most of you know what a flashback is, but a flashback is not just a memory, it's actually a reliving of the experience. So your body feels like you are reliving the abuse or the attack. And that's why it's so horrific, because your body will react you'll have that same terror, that same fear, that same, just the horror of what you've gone through will come flooding back, and you will relive it. So it's actually a question of reliving it, and your body feels like you're back there. And that's why they are so stressful and painful and distressing for women who have flashbacks. They can also happen, they can be triggered by something. There might be a trigger, it could be a smell, a taste, something you see on TV, a word. There could be a trigger, but it could just happen randomly. Very cruelly, flashbacks can start happening when you actually feel relaxed. When you start feeling relaxed, sometimes memories might sort of start moving around and come back. So flashbacks can be very random, and they are always distressing. We're going to be looking at an exercise later on and what we can do when we have a flashback. But for those of you who have flashbacks, again, please have compassion for yourself, because they can be incredibly distressing. You are not alone. They are in a normal response to trauma. They can be very debilitating, and they leave you feeling incredibly vulnerable. So please, please be kind to yourself. Another response is to have hypervigilance. Many women I work with have lost all their trust and faith in humanity. As we've said, if you can't trust your partner, your loved ones, then who can you trust? And that hypervigilance can be a sense of being hyper alert, hyper tense, on the lookout all the time. Now, you're doing that to protect yourself, but it's a very hyper aroused place to be. It's not a relaxed, calm place to be. It's being in a place of terror. If you've experienced sexual abuse or sexual violence, you will know fear and terror, and that terror can stay with you for a very, very long time. And so even if you're not having a flashback, you might just have a sort of low level humming fear in you the whole time. You're always on the lookout. It might be if there's a bang or someone drops something, you will jump out of your skin. If you feel someone behind you, that will be terrifying. If you find yourself sitting at the back of buses, sitting at the back of the room so that no one can come in behind you, if you're always looking for the exit, those things sort of suggest hypervigilance, and they're a normal response to sexual abuse and sexual violence. Other responses are shock, panic attacks, anxiety, that can be very long lasting, depression can be very long lasting, anger, guilt, shame, self-disgust, loss of identity, and numbness, just feeling very flat and numb and nothing. And you might oscillate between all of these. You might have suicidal thoughts. The pain might be too much. You might feel you need to escape from the pain, and the only way to do that is through killing yourself. You might feel a lot of self-blame, that somehow it's your fault. You might feel a lot of self-doubt. You might lose your trust and faith in humanity. You might think, I am dirty and something is wrong with me. You might think something's wrong with your body. You might feel very, very confused about events. You might have lack of memory, which can really add to the confusion. You might get headaches, that's very common. You might have obsessive thoughts where you obsessively ruminate or go over things or think about how you could have done things differently. That's very, very normal and very common and very understandable. You might have developed some sort of compulsive behavior. You might, keep yourself very, very, very busy, compulsively look after other people, compulsively clean or tidy, or develop some sort of OCD type patterns. That can be as a way to block out the reality of your trauma. If you've gone through sexual abuse, it's very likely your sleep will be very, very affected. So on top of everything else, you're probably absolutely exhausted. You may have nightmares. You may have nightmares every time you go to sleep. That can make going to bed very frightening. You might wake up and have sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is when you're sort of in a semi-awake state where you feel like you're awake, but your body is frozen. It can also include feeling like there is a presence in the room, and often a presence, it might feel like there's a weight on your chest or something is sitting on your chest and you can't breathe. And that's really, really terrifying as well. And that can be a symptom of trauma. And many women think something's wrong with them when that happens, or there's something supernatural going on in the room. It's not, it's sleep paralysis, and it's a very real thing that happens with women who have trauma. So insomnia is something that I see a lot of. Night sweats, waking up dripping in sweat, waking up with headaches, feeling sick. Trauma has a big impact on us physiologically. We hold trauma in the body. So it's very normal to have very strong physical reactions. It might really affect your health. Your digestion commonly gets affected. Your immunity gets compromised. You might have a change in appetite. You might comfort eat and try and push down the pain by eating, or you might starve yourself and try and create some sense of control through your eating. You might just give up and have no motivation and just not care about anything and not want to get out of bed in the morning. Very, very normal as well to find it really hard to concentrate. Your brain is in sort of fight or flight panic mode, and so it's very hard to retain information. It's very hard to remember things, very hard to read things and take information and write things. It also have big impacts on your behavior. It's very normal that you will self-isolate because you don't trust people, you will avoid people. You might avoid intimate relationships and sex, and that might be very long term. You might self-harm. You might feel that could be a sense of, you might feel so disgusted or ashamed of your body that you might want to self-harm because of that. Or it might be that you feel like a pressure cooker because you have so many emotions whirring around you that you might want to release them in some way. And in some way that might be a comfort to self-harm. You might self-medicate with drugs and alcohol and food. So it's very normal maybe to develop some sort of addiction as well. If you're not sleeping, that also might be part of it, that you might, what starts off as a glass of wine a night to help you get to sleep or relax you could very easily turn into a bottle or more. And then you could be left having some sort of issue around alcohol, drugs or food or other sort of addictive substance. Again, if you have any of these symptoms, please think of yourself with kindness and compassion. This is a great deal you are coping with. These are very painful and difficult conditions to live with. Very often what happens is women I work with, if they go to their GP, the anxiety and the depression might get a diagnosis, but trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder may very well not get a diagnosis. And so a lot of women I work with, they might get diagnosed antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication, and they might be really, really helpful. And that might really help some women. However, what can be lost is the underlying causes. Why is the person suffering from all these symptoms? What is going on? And then the victim really needs help understanding and making sense of their experience and getting the right support with that. And sadly, a lot of women do not get the right support. However, if at least we know what the impacts of sexual abuse are, we understand trauma, at least we can start thinking about understanding ourselves and looking after ourselves. So I'll move on. So if you have some or all of the symptoms on the last page, you might possibly have post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a normal response to very frightening and abusive behavior. Now, many women feel a lot of shame after sexual abuse. Many women also feel ashamed of having these symptoms, if something is wrong with them and they are not normal. It is very important to try and show understanding and compassion to yourself rather than judge yourself. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a very difficult and painful condition to live with. It means you have suffered a great deal. Many women who come to Women's Trust may also have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and this can be if they experience childhood abuse. If you experience childhood abuse and trauma, you then may well get complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's when you have sort of layers of trauma and they sort of can feed into each other, and you can have a lot of sort of complex, very distressing symptoms. It's really important that you do not judge or shame yourself for having any of these symptoms. You would not judge or shame another woman who'd experienced sexual abuse. So it's really important to try not to judge or shame yourself, but recognize that what happened to you was wrong, very, very wrong. It was not your fault. And there is going to, it will affect you. It would be impossible to walk out of a relationship where there is sexual abuse and sexual violence and for it not to have an impact on you. It will have an impact, and it's very normal that it will have an impact, and that's to be expected. So what we need to do is try and understand what that impact is and how we can try and look after ourselves. And the first way is understanding trauma. And I'll move on now. I'm aware of time running out, so I'll keep moving on. Just to say, it's really important to remember that trauma is most severe when it is human caused rather than a natural disaster. That's because it affects our belief in humanity and our faith in humanity. When it's deliberate rather than random and accidental, If it's random, we can at least think it was a mistake, they didn't mean to do it. If it's deliberate and targeted, we know it's personal against us, and that makes trauma more distressing. If it is repeated, it's more severe. If it is long-term, and if it is done by someone you are in a relationship with, someone you loved and trusted, and it's also more severe if you have experienced past traumas in childhood. So I'm just putting those out there because that will apply to many women who watch this webinar. If we understand trauma and that our responses are normal to be expected, that can help us let go of the shame. So we're now going to move on to letting go of shame. Now, this is a huge, huge subject, but just to get us thinking about it, just to say it is normal and understandable to feel shame after sexual abuse. But this will just keep you feeling like something is wrong with you. If you get stuck in the shame, you will keep on blaming yourself. And in a way, that's a way of the abuse carrying on internally. So it's really important to recognize that nothing is wrong with you. You did not abuse anyone. The abuse you experienced was not your fault. The abuser is an adult and they know the difference between right or wrong, and they chose to be abusive. And it's also important to know that's why they do it in secret. Abusers in domestic abuse are very often charming in public, and they know and they want to have approval. And so they do their abuse in secret when no one else can see it. And so they do know what they're doing is wrong. They did it because they wanted to control you and they wanted to make you scared and dependent on them. Therefore, the abuser should carry the shame of the act because they have done something cruel and abusive, and they did it deliberately. When we replace shame with self-compassion and self-understanding, we start to heal, and we also start to regain our sense of self and our self-respect. When we give ourselves compassion, we are saying, I matter and I deserve to be treated with kindness and respect and dignity. And that is a human right that you all have. So, moving on. Many women feel shame because they did not leave the perpetrator. It is therefore important to understand trauma bonding and why it makes it so hard to leave an abusive relationship. When we take time to understand our behavior, we can learn self-compassion and so not judge ourselves. So we're going to look at trauma bonding quickly now. It's a big subject, but I hope these pointers will just help understand it and why it creates dependency on the very person who is abusing us. Now, one of the most awful questions a woman can be asked is, why did you stay? I think it can be really shaming, and it shows a real lack of understanding about trauma bonding and the dynamic that happens between the victim and the perpetrator. So trauma bonding is a strong psychological connection that develops between the victim and abuser. The abuser isolates the victim and behaves inconsistently. They can be frightening and cruel, but then they can also be kind and affectionate, or they can stop the abuse for a period of time. And then the victim feels gratitude and love for the abuser, and also relief that the abuse has stopped. The abuser can also have another strategy where they can love bomb, and then they can ignore, love bomb and ignore. And then the victim becomes grateful for any attention that she can get. And the sort of language women say is, I was just looking out for the crumbs of love. That sort of language, you get nothing and you just get a little crumb and you're grateful for any attention. The rescuer and the abuser are the very same person, which means the bond becomes deeper than other relationships as the victim depends on the abuser to survive. The victim may also cling on to hope that the abuser will be the good person they met at the start. Many women talk about the Jekyll and Hyde split personality of their abusers, that when they met them, they were like the perfect partner, and then they changed, or they can be perfect at times, and then they become the abuser again. So there's always this hope that maybe if you love them enough, or if you change your behavior, that they will then become the person you first met. And I'm going to quote a woman who came to Women's Trust who gave me permission to use this, that the abuser is both the poison and the cure. So they are both the person causing our pain, but then they also become the cure to our pain as well. And I think that's a really brilliant way of describing trauma bonding. I'll continue. Here we have the drama triangle. It's a very, very simple version of it here, and some of you may have seen it, but the persecutor, the rescuer, and the victim. This was devised by someone called Karpman, and the idea is it shows the way we can get embroiled. It's called a psychological game. Of course, it's not a fun game, it's a very distressing, painful game. Most women will say that whilst they are being victimized by the perpetrator, oh dear, sorry, just go back, they are also trying to rescue the perpetrator as well. And whilst the perpetrator is abusing you, he may go from that position, or he or she may go from being the abuser to then being the rescuer. And it's very, very confusing. That's the poison and the cure. They rescue you and then they abuse you. And that keeps you stuck in that victim-like place. And I think the drama triangle is a very, very valuable tool, because when you recognize that's happening, you can then make choices about whether you want to be in that relationship dynamic. So I think it can be a really helpful tool. Many women describe that they were always trying to rescue their perpetrator, even while he or she is abusing them. The other thing that can happen, which women can then get shame about, is if you're being abused and abused and abused and abused for a long time, you might at some point snap, and then you might retaliate, and then you might feel like you've become the perpetrator and they're the victim. And that can become a really, really difficult shaming dynamic that you can get forced into. When we see that pattern happening, we can then think about how we break out from it. So that's an important dynamic to recognize in trauma bonding. I'll just continue. So through trauma bonding, the victim can lose her identity. All her energy and focus is on the abuser in order to try and predict and survive the abusive behavior. So this is really important. The victim will lose herself and just become tuned in to the abuser so that they can predict and survive the abusive behavior. The victim may start to believe that the abuser's actions are because of her own flaws, and so tries harder to appease the abuser and keep the peace. So the expression treading on eggshells is used very often by women who come to Women's Trust and women who've experienced abuse. That sense, you're always treading on eggshells around them, always waiting for a bomb to go off, always trying to keep the peace. The victim doubts herself and her reality, and her main goal becomes gaining the abuser's approval and validation. Other relationships can seem flat in comparison, and the victim is often isolated from others, and so no longer has a gauge of what a healthy relationship is. This becomes her normal, and she thinks this is just what relationships are like. This dynamic creates a sense of codependency where the victim can feel she can't survive without the abuser. Again, if you've trauma bonded or you have experienced that, please be aware that that's an inevitable consequence of being in an abusive relationship, and it happens because of the dynamic of power and control. Trauma bonding is a survival strategy because in the short term, it makes it easier for the victim to survive within the relationship, because you're second guessing them, because you lose yourself in the relationship. It helps you survive for longer. It helps you survive, but long term, it will break down your sense of self. You will stop expressing yourself in order to survive, and the abusive behavior becomes normalized, and the victim doubts her own sense of reality and then starts doubting whether this is even abuse. Once you are in a trauma bond and it's been in it for some time, it becomes extremely difficult for a victim to leave the relationship. It really does. And there's also all the other factors that make it very, very hard for women to leave, such as practicalities. You know, if you share a house, if you have children with this person, if you're financially dependent on them, if you're not allowed, if you have no support system and you're isolated, all those practical factors make it very, very, very hard to leave an abusive relationship. And it's so important that we understand trauma bonding and why women stay, because when women are asked that, why did you stay if it's so bad? It can be a really shaming question that again puts the responsibility on the victim rather than on the perpetrator of the abuse. They should be being asked, why are you behaving like that? That's the question that should be asked. Okay, moving on. So healing from sexual abuse is a big, big subject. And I'm aware that we're in a pandemic, and so our resources are limited. So we're just going to try and think now about what we can do for ourselves. So I will repeat this again because I think it's really key. Self-understanding and self-compassion are the key to healing and releasing shame. It is important to try and replace internal criticism and judgment with self-understanding and nurturing. And I hope that today has just given you a little bit more of that. I hope so. Self-care means treating yourself with kindness and respect. And those are that's the opposite to the abuse you've experienced. When you do that, you're recognizing your dignity as a human being and your human rights. So please think about showing yourself these qualities just as you would do to a friend who'd been abused. Patience, really important to be patient with yourself. It takes time to heal from sexual violence and sexual abuse. So patience, gentleness, respect, nurturing attention, non-judgment, warmth, kindness, empathy, and understanding. If we can think about bringing those words and trying to cultivate those qualities within you when you're with yourself. Self-care can also be very practical things like eating 3 meals a day. A lot of women neglect themselves, they neglect their diet, and then that affects everything. That can affect your mood, anxiety, your sleeping patterns. I know it's hard, but trying to do some basics, like might be going for a walk in nature if you feel safe enough to do that, practicing sleep hygiene. By that, I mean trying to go to bed at a regular time, trying to get up at a regular time, trying not to look at screens too much before you go to sleep, avoiding caffeine, having herbal teas if they help you go to sleep, investing in yourself, investing in the quality of your sleep. Some women find podcasts really helpful, maybe when they're going to sleep or maybe when they're feeling anxious. Could be listen to a soothing podcast or some sort of guided meditation. Spending time with safe people, the word safe being really important. When you have come out of an abusive relationship or are healing from sexual abuse, you are incredibly vulnerable. So please think of yourself with great care and be very protective of yourself and only be around people who you feel safe and who you trust. And that is why coming to groups that Women's Trust can be really good, because it might be that there's no one in your life you feel safe with. But if you come to a specific centre for women affected by abuse and you know that other women there will understand it, and you meet in a confidential, safe space, that might be a step in the right direction. It might be that you choose to watch a comforting film. I'd also be very careful about what you expose yourself to, in terms of what you read online, what you watch on TV. If something feels too triggering, if you don't want to go anywhere, you don't have to force yourself to do things. You don't have to prove anything to yourself. Be incredibly patient with yourself. Just a quick exercise here that is something you might want to think about if you're having a flashback. Developing mindfulness and being in the here and now can help when experiencing a flashback, and this exercise can be useful. Let's start by acknowledging what is going on and what you're experiencing and you're feeling. Just by acknowledging you're having a flashback, it can then give you a bit of sense of power. You're having a flashback. Okay, so what can you do about that? So you can say, I'm feeling scared and I'm feeling overwhelmed because I'm having a flashback. And bring some understanding about that. You're having a flashback because you've got trauma. So it's now, if you can, try and do something that makes you feel grounded. So sit down, so you're held by the chair. Put the soles of your feet on the floor so you feel the ground underneath your feet. And if you're able to look around the room and try and find, it might be 10 or 15 pink or blue or green or gold or whatever colored objects. Look around the room. This exercise will get you out of your head and help you notice what is around you in the physical space, if you're able to do that. Feel your feet on the floor and you can say to yourself something like this. Today is the 16th of March, 2021. I can see them around me. And I can also hear, it might be you can hear my next door neighbor hoovering quite often at this point. I might hear a bird tweeting outside. Say what you hear to yourself, say what you see. You might look down at your hands, you might look at what you're wearing. I can see I'm wearing a blue jumper today. And then you might say, so I know the trauma is not happening now. And I know that I am safe. This is about you reassuring yourself, if you are safe, that you are safe. Okay, if you're not safe, then you have a right to be safe and to get somewhere safe. Okay, so this exercise really only works if you are in a safe place, but it's about reassuring yourself that the flashback is not happening now. Okay, it might feel like it is, but it's not happening. It's about reassuring yourself. If you're able to do that, you might feel very vulnerable afterwards. You might cry. You might feel very shaky. So please be very, very kind to yourself in that state. Try to develop some understanding and compassion for yourself in that moment. Flashbacks are very upsetting and frightening. So please try and be kind to yourself just as you would to a friend. After a flashback, it's very normal to have tremors and to feel very cold and shaky and feel very vulnerable. You might need a sweet cup of tea, you might need to put a blanket around you. You might need support, you might need to talk to someone. So we're going to end the webinar soon. So thank you for your patience and listening to this. So just last of all, some notes on getting support. When we have been abused, we can lose our trust and faith in human nature, and it can be tempting to self-isolate as this feels safer. However, this can make life lonely and empty. So it's important we find ways of getting support and connection with people when we are ready to do so. Workshops and support groups can be a safe way of meeting other people who have had similar experiences in a confidential setting. Some women find voluntary work a good way to be with others in a safe way, and that can also increase our self-esteem. That can be a safe way of sort of recognizing your worth. Now, right now, because of COVID, a lot of these things are not possible to do, but there are online things, there are online workshops and support groups at Women's Trust. When the world opens up again, there might be things like yoga classes, gym, art classes can be a safe way to meet people in an environment where you have something to do and you don't have to talk about yourself if you don't want to. So I think about finding safe ways to connect with others, safe ways to get support. I'd also think about connecting with nature. A lot of women I work with find solace maybe in animals or nature. If you feel humanity has let you down, it might be a way of connecting with other things, other living things that make you feel safe, like nature or animals can be an option. So where to get support? Getting the right support makes all the difference. At Women's Trust, we offer one-to-one counselling, dependent on the borough you live in, and therapeutic support groups and psychoeducational workshops. And at the moment, we're doing them all online. And there's a list here of other services in London which also offer therapeutic support. And you can check out all of these websites. I've also put the Samaritans phone line there, 116123. It's a 24-hour helpline, and it is manned by people who are trained to give emotional support. And you do not have to be suicidal. It is for any human being who feels distress and needs to speak to another human being in a safe, confidential way. You don't have to say anything about your details, and it is there. And I know a lot of women who've used the Samaritans, and it's been really helpful. Lastly, I'm not a legal person in any way, so I cannot give any legal advice, but at the bottom of this, there's the Rights of Women website, and they have a really good PDF booklet, which is about your rights as a woman and international and national law for violence against women and women who've experienced sexual abuse. So if you are interested in finding out more, that's really worth looking at. So last of all, that's the services we offer at Women's Trust, and there's our website there, and we also have some resources on our website. So thank you so much for coming today. I'm now going to stop the recording. So I'm just going to stop that now.